You know, the story of the predicament of how America got into the situation it's in now, where we've got a lopsided return to the top 1% and the middle class is stuck in the mud and stuck in the rut, really goes back to the 1970s. It's a long story. And it begins with a rather surprising disclosure. Something I didn't know when I was running the New York Times Washington Bureau in the 1970s, that a lawyer, corporate lawyer named Lewis Powell, was so upset by the power of the consumers movement, the women's movement, the civil rights movement, the environmental movement, and the pressure they were putting on government policy and on the profits of big business, that he went to friends in the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and told them American free enterprise was under mortal threat and that business leaders should organize and fight back. And he wrote a manifesto for corporate America. He was a Paul Revere that rallied corporate leaders, what I call a revolt of the bosses, and said, you've got to organize, you've got to take the high ground, you need to identify your enemies, you need to go after them aggressively. And believe it or not, that is what happened. When Powell wrote his memo, only 175 companies even had offices in Washington. National Association of Manufacturers didn't even have one of them, wasn't even there. Within 4 months of his memo, the Business Roundtable, now the most powerful business lobby in Washington, was formed by leaders who were circulating this Powell memorandum. Within 8 years, there were 2,425 companies with offices in Washington. There were 9,000 corporate lobbyists. There were 50,000 people working for business trade associations. I call it Powell's Army. And they went on the offensive, as Powell had suggested, and they affected government policy. And what's interesting is that most people think that happened when Ronald Reagan and the Republicans took over in the early 80s. But in fact, to my surprise, I'll admit, it took place when Jimmy Carter, a Democrat, was in the White House, and when the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress. Powell's Army went to work. They blocked legislation that the trade union movement, the labor movement, wanted. They blocked legislation that Ralph Nader and the consumer movement wanted. And they instituted the 401k plan, which shifted hundreds of billions of dollars of costs from the corporate books to the pocketbooks and checkbooks of ordinary employees and citizens. They changed the corporate bankruptcy laws to help management and that hurt the trade union movement and average workers. They got rid of the limits on interest rates, which set the stage for the housing bubble and bust in the 2000s. They began deregulating industry, and most importantly, they lowered the corporate tax rate and they drastically lowered the investment tax rate, which we call the capital gains rate. All that greatly benefited the people at the top of the economic period and hurt the middle class over time. But at the time, we didn't recognize what was going on. It's one of those cases where history has hidden beginnings and you don't discover them until long afterward. Wow. One of the really critical questions we need to examine and answer is how did we have an earlier America in which prosperity was widely shared, where the middle class benefited along with the corporate elite and the financial elite in the growth of the American economy and the profits of the great American corporations and in the efficiency of the American economy, the productivity. From 45 to 75, that's what happened. America grew, we had more profits, and the middle class actually shared in the benefits. And one of the reasons is business leaders at that time believed in what they called stakeholder capitalism. They believed in sharing the wealth. They believed that was good business and smart economics. If they paid tens of millions of middle-class workers well, this was what they reasoned, then those workers would go out and spend that money, which would generate large consumer demand, which would push the economy to grow and cause business to expand production, build new plants, buy new equipment, hire more workers. Economists call that the virtuous circle of growth. Every part of this process in the wheel pushed the next part. That was the secret of America's stunning growth from the end of World War II up until the late 1970s. What changed after that was there was a change in power, but most importantly, there was also a change in the viewpoint of business leaders. They shifted from stakeholder capitalism to shareholder capitalism. They got the idea from Milton Friedman, a famous University of Chicago economist, that the mission of the CEO, the sole mission, was to deliver the highest return to the shareholders. Now before, they were worried about the shareholders They were worried about the managers, they were worried about the workers, the towns they operated in, the suppliers, the bankers, the customers, a whole panoply, all the groups that had a stake in the success of the corporation. But come the 1980s and the 1990s, and even more in the 2000s, they focused solely on one group, maximum return to shareholders. And when you do that, you're going to hold down wages, you're going to ship jobs overseas, you're actually going to hold wages down to the point where you have low wages, and guess what? Low consumer demand and low growth. High inequality of income from 1979 to 2011. The ratio between a typical big company CEO's pay and the average worker went from 30 or 40 to 1 to nearly 300 to 1. 84% of all the gains in the entire nation's income from 1979 to 2011 went to the top 1%, which means that the bottom 99% got 16%, 5 times as much went to the top 1% as went to the entire rest of the country. That's why we got this enormous explosion of income inequality, spiking way up in the 2000s, but it had been building over a period of 30 years. And then public policy did reinforce that. We got tax cuts for the wealthy. The minimum wage stayed stuck back where it was. In fact, it's below where it was in the 1960s. And the payroll tax, which everybody pays, but particularly middle-class workers, that rose. So public policy reinforced this push by shareholder capitalism to give almost all the gains to the people at the top and to leave the middle class stuck in the mud. Well, what we found out, and there's a very interesting book by Thomas Piketty, a French economist, called Capitalism in the 21st Century. And he tries to address the question of how wealth begets wealth and why we get a widening income gap as the economy grows. Because the old theory was if it grows, then everybody's going to benefit and everybody, the rising tide will lift all boats. Well, it turns out that's not correct. Piketty went back and he looked at capitalism in France and England and America over the last couple of hundred years. And what he found out was, and the numbers show this, that if the return on money, that is, if people on Wall Street, rich people, invest in companies, in stocks, in timber, in land, in oil, in gas, and natural resources, if their return is higher than the growth rate of the national economy, then income gap spreads. For example, if the return on money is 6 or 7%, but the economy is only going 3 or 4%, then most people are going to be stuck down there at 3 or 4%, or maybe lower, 1 or 2%. And the people who are making money from money are going to be making 6 or 7%. Warren Buffett, one of the leading investors in America, who runs Berkshire Hathaway, makes $39–40 million a year. He's worth several tens of billions of dollars. And he says, how come I make $40 million a year and my secretary makes $40,000, but she pays a higher tax rate than I do? And the reason is we tax profits on money, because we call it capital gains, at a lower rate than we tax money from work, from sweat, from typing on a computer, from writing stories, from teaching at a university. Work gets taxed higher than profits made from money. That's another reason why you see this widening, ever-widening gap. And only public policy changes can affect that. Raising the minimum wage, higher taxes on the people at the top, programs that will help retrain workers so they're able to compete better in the new global economy. The shift in power that took place in America starting in the late 1970s, and by that I mean the shift from the power of the middle class, which was active in pushing government to be responsive to its needs and demands, a women's movement seeking higher pay for women, an environmental movement seeking better protection of the environment, a consumer movement seeking more honest and open transactions, trying to keep Detroit from making automobiles with defects that were killing people, getting food and drugs inspected more helpfully, a labor movement that fought for higher wages and better benefits. That was the power in the 40s, 50s, and 60s and 70s, and then it shifted to the power of business lobbies, which grew starting in the late 70s and really built up over the next 3 decades. It had a direct impact on policy. It starts under Jimmy Carter with deregulation and the 401k program, but it really accelerates under Ronald Reagan and the Republicans in the 1980s. The tax cuts under Ronald Reagan have added $1 trillion to the wealth of the top 1% every decade. $1 trillion in the 80s, $1 trillion in the 90s, and $1 trillion in the 2000s, and then the tax cuts of George W. Bush added another $1 trillion. So that's $4 trillion. So the power of these business lobbies, bringing down the tax rates on the people at the top, and also preventing the rise of the minimum wage, which helped people at the bottom, help increase this enormous wealth gap that we have in America, which is actually not good economics. It's slowing the economy. When you have high inequality of income, there are lots of studies that show this, you get slow growth. And the reason is, it takes good consumer demand from 100 to 150 million middle-class Americans to push the economy. If they're not paid well, it's low demand, low growth. Well, the most significant change that occurred that affected workers and companies was the 401k plan. The 401k plan has shifted the cost of retirement, basically the bulk of it, from the companies that used to provide lifetime pension benefits. In 1980, 84% of the people who worked for companies with 100 employees or more got a lifetime benefit. What that means is from the moment they retired till the moment they died, they got a monthly check. That was paid for by their employers. Now, something like 20% get that, and it's mostly older people who have that as a legacy benefit from the past. Today, retirement is funded by 401k plans. Some of that is contributed by the companies, but less than by people, and the cost shift has been enormous. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year are shifted from corporate books to the private checkbooks and pocketbooks of ordinary people. And then the second thing that really had a big effect was the change in the bankruptcy law in 1978. They used to have bankruptcy referees. If a company went into bankruptcy, it was turned over to a neutral party because everybody knew bankruptcy meant economic pain for everybody. And what the companies did in 1978 was to lobby to change the law and said, let's keep the old corporate management in charge of the company. And what that means is through the process of bankruptcy, that's old management. That's the party that is making the decisions on how to carry out the bankruptcy, and it has cost workers hundreds of billions of dollars in each individual settlement. In United Airlines, the workers had to give up $4 billion worth of pay and benefits. So the change in that law that left the power in the hands of the old management worked out in the 90s in the steel industry, in the 2000s in the airline industry, to the great disadvantage of workers and to the benefit of management, which not only kept control of the company, but came out of the bankruptcy in charge and owning a big chunk of the company. Most people in America today will say the American political system is broken. And what they mean by that is that when they look at Washington, they see gridlock. They see a Congress in particular, but a Congress and a president, but mostly Congress, that cannot deal with any of the major issues confronting the country. Climate change, immigration, national debt, dealing with the entitlements, Social Security, Medicare, student debt, you name it. Congress is not dealing with it. And what's happened is, over time, politicians and political parties have created political monopolies. We don't think of them that way. Historically, we call it gerrymandering. What they do is they create safe legislative districts. The Republicans do it in some states, the Democrats do it in other states, both parties do it. To the point where, as we go into every House election for the House of Representatives, a good political reporter can tell you the party outcome in 85 to 90% of the races before the election begins, because the districts have been constructed to make sure that party will win. Well, that has two bad effects. Parties get more and more extreme. The main race that takes place in those districts is in the party primary, because you have to win the primary in order to get the general election, and then in the general election the other party doesn't stand a chance because of the way the lines were drawn. So parties get more and more extreme, candidates get more and more extreme, and when they go to Washington, they're like the two ends of the football field. They're like at the goalposts in the football field. They're shouting at each other from the opposite ends. And what's happened is the middle has disappeared. Now, there are some states that are trying to do something about that. They're having citizens' commissions now draw the lines. California is doing that. Iowa is doing that. Several other states are doing that. Arizona is doing that, with the idea that citizens will be more neutral. there'll be more competition, and in fact it's true, there is more competition. And other states like Washington State say, let's forget party primaries, let's make everybody run in the same election. Okay? All the candidates, Republicans, Democrats, Greens, Independents, you name it, all the voters, they all go in there, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, and it's very interesting what happens. The politicians who are seeking office have to run more towards the center. They have to appeal across party lines to people on the other side. When Washington State started that in 2008, the first election was 2010, the turnout in all 9 of Washington's congressional districts went up an average of 20%. Why? Because there were a whole lot of moderates and independents who couldn't vote in the Republican Party, who couldn't vote, the Republican primary, who couldn't vote in the Democratic primary. But when they had a combined primary, they could vote. And there were a whole lot of other people who said, if I'm in a Republican district and I'm a Democrat, my vote doesn't count, no point in voting. Suddenly when you had the single primary, it's called the top 2 primary, the top 2 people go into the general election. And generally, it's a Republican and a Democrat. But when California did it in 2012, you actually had some districts where 2 Republicans were running against each other in the general election, and several districts where 2 Democrats were running against each other. But the point was the person who was closer to the center was far more likely to win than the person who was further to the outside. Now, why is that important to gridlock? Because as you get candidates moving towards the center, you begin to restore the moderate middle in American politics, and it takes the moderate middle as the lubricant which makes the wheels of government turn, which make compromise possible. So that kind of reform, the reform of political monopolies, the reform of gerrymander, the reform of the party primary system, is absolutely central if we're going to get our American democracy back for the average voter and working again for the whole country.
Wow.
There's a sense in America that our political and economic system has gone so far off track that there's really nothing we can do about it. We average people feel as though we're powerless. There are powerful lobbies in America, in Washington. Believe it or not, business lobbies outspend labor lobbies 60 to 1. They outspend consumer lobbies 100 to 1. People look at that, they look at all the money coming into the political campaigns, and they think things are hopeless. I don't agree. Traveling the country, I find lots of people all over the country deeply worried about the country, wanting to get engaged, hungry for a leader that will lead them towards some kind of reform that will restore and revive American democracy and will tackle certain issues. In economics, we need to rebuild the middle class, and that means we need to have a national strategy to rebuild our manufacturing, to modernize our national transportation network, which is, by the way, way behind the ports and airports and bullet trains in Japan and China and places like that. We're out of date. We don't even know it. And the Chamber of Commerce, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, Voice of Business is telling us we've lost $1 trillion worth of growth because our transportation network's so old. So we got to do something about that. We got to do something to help more students afford to be able to go to college. I mean, student debt is now over $1.2 trillion. There are lots of low-income and middle-income families that don't even dream of sending their kids to college because they think they can't afford it. Those young people are our seed corn. They're our future. If we're going to compete globally, if they're going to compete globally, we've got to help them. So we need to do things like that, and lots of others. We need to rationalize the corporate tax system, bring down the rates, close the loopholes, a lot of things. But the biggest things we have to do are reform and revive and correct our political system. As long as we have political monopolies and gerrymandering that create safe districts and basically blunt the votes of average voters and exclude the moderate middle, we're not going to get there. As long as we have uncontrolled Niagaras of money, oceans, rivers of money flowing into and drowning American democracy in elections, the elite, the financial elite, the people with that money, they're always going to be able to capture government. Do they buy the votes? Not directly, but they capture the votes. They go after it and they get the kind of policies they want. If we want things back, we're going to have to get active. We're going to have to get civically active at the grassroots level. Here in Florida, up in New Hampshire, Washington State, Illinois, Ohio, Texas, Oklahoma, everywhere. It's happened in the past in American history. Think of the revolution. It was a popular revolution. The Minutemen, Bunker Hill, okay? The Tea Party, even that. And then think of the progressive era. That was an era when Teddy Roosevelt was going after the trusts, but it was also an era when women got the vote. There was a mass movement of women to push for the vote. There was a push to have direct election of senators. You know, for over 100 years in American democracy and the Republic, it was state legislatures that elected the senators. Now we elect them directly. That reform came from popular pressure from below. And then the movements I mentioned before, the civil rights movement, the women's movement, the consumer movement, the environmental movement, the labor movement, the peace movement, those are all movements where hundreds of thousands of people, and in the case of the environmental movement, millions of people, got up off their couches. They didn't tweet, they didn't go to Facebook. They went out in the streets and they marched and they demanded change. And you know, within 1 year, Congress passed 7 major pieces of environmental legislation. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, Anti-Toxic Substances Act, Clean Drinking Water Act, on and on and on. All but one of them signed by a very strong pro-business Republican president, Richard Nixon. And what that shows is that people power can make a difference. But we have to believe in it. People say today they feel powerless. A friend of mine in Texas said to me at one point, a great organizer, Ernie Cortez in San Antonio, Texas, said to me, you know, Rick, power corrupts. That's what they say. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. But powerlessness also corrupts. It corrupts democracy at its core. We have to believe in our own power and take it back and renew American democracy and reclaim the American dream. We can do it. We just have to believe we can do it. And then start at the local level. We're not going to change Washington overnight, but start at home, in your own town, your own community, your own county, your own state. And state by state, by the way, lots of states are actually at work doing this. And we don't know very much about it from one state to the next. Change is coming, but it's coming from the bottom and from the bottom up and from the outside in. That's the way democracy should work, and it's starting to percolate, starting to work that way. So why not join up?